that the basketball games are on television, they are reported in the TV, they are discussed every day by people. This is a huge motivation for the teams. Transparency is not something evil. I always get this look when I say transparency is very important. Yes, fine, but you don't understand, we're different. We can't do that, you see. It would create all sorts of problems. But it is something, both for the owners, it's fantastic, because it actually creates more power over these entities. And for the entities, it empowers them. It makes them more motivated. It is, I must say, I could talk a lot about this, but I think it's magical. And there is, I mean, just one last point. This is a bit overdone, but rating for doing bond issuance, getting back to the capital markets, is an amazing tool. There are strategic assets that you don't want to privatize and put on the stock market. But you will get almost the same effect by doing a bond rating and issuing debt, because they go through the same process as you do for an IPO. It's an amazing tool, not to be forgotten and not to be overlooked. The target that I think is important to keep in mind, and that is coming back to the political decision. You decide what is a competitive sector, then it's important for the owners, the politicians, to decide what in this company that we own in this sector is strategic. This is a very, very important issue, because many times state-owned enterprises or government-owned enterprises tend to be very wild conglomerates or very big corporates, and it's important to come back to the roots and really understand what is it that we really want to keep, and put the rest aside so that you can focus on your core business. And this is an absolutely crucial question. And then all the rest is like the school book. It just follows on that you need a competitive capital structure, governance structure, everything, which is, very easy. But again, to have a consolidated annual report over the whole portfolio that is commercial is absolutely fantastic tool. And also to have a valuation of that portfolio creates an enormous incentive for everybody who is working with this, for the companies, for the employees, and for the government people that are in charge of overseeing such a portfolio. It gives you a very clear target, and it gives you a very good map. And I think that is the essence, and the reason why I'm sure that you are all going to be very successful in this. Thank you. The Finnish way of structuring the ownership function, I think, is commendable, because it's very clear. What many people do, my own country, Sweden, has put it into the Ministry of Industry, which I think is not very clear. And they've also gone back to the dual model, actually, which is even less good. Other people put it inside some kind of not really an authority, but some kind of division inside a ministry of Finance, a Ministry of Industry, or whatever, or even some kind of authority without real authority and responsibility. But in the Finnish case, they have put it in a ministry with very clear responsibility, very clear objective what they should achieve. They have also done an additional thing by and almost taking a second step, and that is created a holding company for all the assets that are due for privatization. So which is preparing them even more for becoming and to be seen and to be managed as a private company. So that's why I think Pekka can talk at length about this, but that's why, in my perspective, I think they have managed to overcome that political hurdle, because it takes a lot of political courage or energy to walk this line of progression towards a holding company, which I then think is very good. But not every country are able to do that, which have their own reasons. And it's not about, actually I got this question last night, it's not about political system actually, because it's about political momentum. There are centralized governments that are not able to take such a strong step in this direction because there are too many vested interests around these companies. This is the issue with state-owned enterprises. There are too many vested interests. And that's why it takes a lot of political courage to do these things. And it's getting rid of this, I call it fragmentation. It's cutting through fragmentation, which really creates the momentum for the governance of SOEs. And that's why I think this first step, or it could be the first step, of creating an ownership function is so fundamental. Because it sets the tone for the rest. If we then assume that the government has decided that the railways or the post office, which is often the case, those are probably the two most, electricity in some countries, should be run on commercial grounds. In other words, and for the reason that you want to get more competition, lower prices, etc., then the issue of separation between policy and commercial runs all the way through company, through the company governance, which means that the prices for a ticket or for a stamp on a postage stamp or the electricity to your house or heating is commercially set on commercial grounds. However, if people are not able to pay, it should not be subsidized through the company, which then will corrupt their objectives. So the company has only one objective, which is be as efficient as possible and maximizing value of that company. But the social aspect for the people who cannot afford a letter or if it is a railway should have instead be financed with social subsidies from the Minister of Social Affairs or whoever is taking care of these kind of issues for people who need that kind of help and support from the government. And it's the same if I take another example, if you have delivery of post or railways that are not commercially then, if you tell the railway company, you are going to be commercial as of 2012, you will be very sure that the railway company will then come back and say, very good, but then we have 15 lines here that we cannot run because they are not commercially viable. What they then should do, what the government then has to do, in my view, instead of pumping in subsidies to the railway company, which will again diffuse the clear objective, you instead say that the parliament or the government will then say, here we have 15 lines up for procurement, and the lowest bidder with the best offer gets to service these lines at the price that the competition, the procurement, comes up with. In that way, and you do this, whatever, biannually, whatever that sector requires. In that way, the government knows, and the funding is coming from Parliament, not from the public money, not from corporate money. So in that way, you have separated everything down to the last bottom line and to every operational issue. And the same thing with postal, etc., etc. I mean, if you have a natural monopoly, it's pretty difficult to privatize it and without transferring a lot of money, so to speak. Then you have to have a very strict regulation. So natural monopolies, I think, are quite difficult in the private sector, unless you are extremely good, and I think the UK government is probably the leaders on this, how to calculate all these cost plus and all these, I forgot the terms, I have been working as a banker with these kind of things, but they have been very, very good at constructing this despite that it's a natural monopoly. So there are precedences, yes, but it's difficult and it requires a very sophisticated economy, I would say, where the government shouldn't be. I mean, you could say that there's no reason for governments to be in anything where there is competition, really, because they will always be under the suspicion that it is an unfair advantage for the government. And also, to be quite clear, it is not very easy to be a government company in a competitive sector. Because one, you're always under suspicion, and two, if the political installation is not good enough, you have to work under conditions which are not competitive to the private sector. It's much more difficult to be a government-owned company when, if you're not properly insulated, if you don't have ability to get equity on demand as you can, if you're not listed, etc. You have to go through the parliamentary session of a budget, and that's a nightmare. You can't act in a commercial way. So there are, depending on how it's structured, the whole governance structure, it could be both benefits and drawbacks being in a commercial sector. But then you have, what I'm talking about is really that, because before, I would say, yes, I would say, before the Swedish example, which I was leading, the consensus, the Washington consensus and everything, whatever it was, that SOEs should be privatized, basta. There's no other way. What we did show was, and I'm not saying I'm recommending this, but it is that if you manage SOEs in a certain way, have a certain structure, you can actually make them profitable. We outperformed the stock market 6 quarters in a row, and they were extremely unprofitable companies before we started our restructurings. So what I'm saying is it is possible. I'm not saying it is the ideal, but when countries, for whatever reason, economic or strategic, needs to have a full ownership or some ownership of these assets, it is possible to govern in a professional way, given that you are doing this bike repair shop in a good way. So that's really what I'm saying. And it's also, which will give you better revenues, more dividends in the meantime. And if you would like to privatize, which I think is a very good point, you will get a lot more for these companies if you have restructured them and managing them in a near to commercial way. I think that's the main points. The reason for government ownership is very varied. I mean, it's everything from what you're saying to failures, corporate failures. We have that in Sweden, we have it in many other countries, we have it in the UK, the US, everybody has it these days. And then you have, as you're saying, if you're looking at the oil-rich states, I mean, for them to relinquish control over, a monocrop society or economy would be very, very difficult. So they have to find a way how to run these companies and still be quite professional. And they can't really create competition in the oil sector in that country. It's not, but they still have to do something. So that, I think this is what we're talking about, how to manage if you have to own anyway. I think it's no different from state-owned. I mean, it's the same principles. And many cities actually create, if they're large, they create big holding companies for their assets, if they're commercially. In Europe, I would say that my limited experience of Europe, of municipalities, have mostly been, water companies, electricity companies. It's been, what do you call them? Airports. So it's very limited. While if you go out east, you have cities in Asia that have more assets than some countries in Europe has. So they are vast industries, and they often benefit, or they always benefit from creating or following the same kind of guidelines to create a holding company so that they're not under, so that they're not mixing the policy issues with the corporate issues, with the commercial issues. So I think it's very varied. In terms of geography and jurisdiction. But I don't see a difference in terms of how you govern, because it's the same, at the bottom it's the same issue again, that you will not get very efficient if you're following if you have multiple objectives.